Nepotism, favoritism, patronage all have one thing in common. They all are relationships that impact how a person is treated at work or how others perceive that they are treated at work. The real human resource issue is that all of these relationships allow factors not relevant to human resource goals to impact human resource decisions. Favoritism, patronage, and nepotism cause the feeling of inequality. Inequality is a difference that cannot be explained by legitimate human resource factors. As inequality spreads throughout the organization, it disrupts productivity. It's a cancer on the organization, and we'll talk about that. In every lesson, we want to examine how that area of study impacts the human resource system goals. In this case, favoritism, patronage, and nepotism, and the policies that seek to avoid those ills in the workplace, try to attract, retain, and develop a workforce that is competent and productive. And what they also try to do is operate within the budgetary constraints of the public sector employer, or in this case also the private sector employer. Now let's talk about that productivity element. If a person is competent at the job, most employees, most workforces will not care if they are hired and also have a relationship which falls into the area of favoritism, patronage, or nepotism. As long as they are hired properly and treated in the same way, paid in the same way, and the treatment is equitable, most employees will be satisfied and won't say many or much of anything. The real fear about favoritism, patronage, and nepotism is that it causes the organization to hire those who are not as competent and therefore not as productive. And because of the relationship, they become untouchable. They cannot be corrected and they cannot be terminated. This causes the organization to be less productive. Therefore, one of the HR goals of producing a workforce that is competent and productive isn't met because you now, by definition, hired someone who is not competent and productive. The other HR goal, to work within the budgetary constraints, is also impacted. This is impacted because favoritism, nepotism, and patronage manifests itself oftentimes in terms of pay. And when the pay is unfairly increased, it strains the budget because you're paying a person who isn't competent to do work and paying them more than what they should be paid. That also results in productivity being decreased because employees lose morale and they're less productive. The employees around that person who see and know that they're being paid more and doing less. And you also lose productivity because there is an increase in turnover. People think they're being treated unfairly, unethically, inequitably, and therefore they leave the organization and move to an organization which they think treats people in a fair and equitable manner. That turnover causes decreased productivity. Favoritism is the hardest of these inappropriate relationships to define, and it can be the most dangerous of these inappropriate relationships. Favoritism is based on relationships of like or socialization. That's hard to measure, it's hard to detect. Many times, the other relationships are based on some well-defined, distinct affiliation, family, political party. Favoritism does not have to be premised on that. Favoritism can be premised upon similar backgrounds. If joining the same fraternity, being a member of the same sorority, attending the same college, attending the same high school, growing up in the same neighborhood, looking like a person's child. Favoritism can be premised upon, again, any of these sort of ephemeral factors that are sometimes hard to detect and hard for employees to discern why it's occurring, but they always know that this person is getting the best assignments, is being treated better, has the halo effect that we'll discuss later, and it's for a reason other than meritorious work. You've walked in stores and you've seen stores where the staff seem to all look alike, or been in offices where everyone had a very similar background. That could be a result of favoritism, a person who has a preference for people who look this way or who are from this kind of background. If favoritism is premised on factors or influenced by factors that have an impact on race, gender, national origin, religion, handicap status, then favoritism now turns into unlawful discrimination. But before you get to that, you still can have just plain favoritism, which isn't discrimination. And the standard that we look on is that we look to see, was this decision based upon some social relationship that is not a legitimate human resource factor. Favoritism occurs in every sector of employment, both public, private, and nonprofit, because people like each other people. Nepotism occurs in an instance in which human resource decisions are premised upon or supported by family ties, not legitimate human resource factors. The standard that applies is you ask the question, is there a family relationship? And two, did this relationship influence the decision, or is it perceived as influencing the decision? And the reason why that perception language is there is that in nepotism, it is not necessary that the employee relative actually be treated better. The relationship, once discovered, will be under constant scrutiny by the workers, those in the organization. And the workers will look for the slightest chance to see if the organization makes a difference and they will explain that difference by the family relationship. Most organizations in government have policies against nepotism. Even in the private sector and the nonprofit sector, many organizations, large organizations, have policies against nepotism. However, in many private sector organizations, those policies are waived, or they're not actually applicable. You take Ford Motors, for example. The head of Ford Motors is likely going to be a relative of Ford. Why? Because of a relative of Ford family. Why? Because the Ford family is the major stockholder in the company. They are the owners. And as the owner, they're going to choose who will lead the organization, and they choose members of the Ford family. When I worked for DuPont, it was not unusual for the DuPont family member to be the chairman of the board. I worked for a division of Mead Corporation one time, and the owner of this particular subsidiary, one of the major owners of this subsidiary, had a son. That son would come in late, take breaks, and get promoted. But people realized that there was a family corporation and that he was going to be given privileges that others were not. So sometimes in the private sector, nepotism is not those policies don't apply because the family ownership of the entity.
Hello, I'm Paul Michelman, Director of Content for Harvard Business Digital, and I'm here today with Jill Corkindale, Executive Coach and author of the Letter from London blog on Harvard Business Online. Jill, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Jill, our theme for today is nepotism, a hot-button topic in business, if there ever was one. You recently wrote a entry in your blog about nepotism. Tell us about your point of view.
That really, the point about nepotism came to me really by way of nothing. It just, something occurred to me from the past. And I was actually away on vacation. And I was thinking about work and the kind of work I used to do. I used to be a journalist, and the work I'm doing now. And I was looking at my career path, really, and it was going pretty well, I thought, until one day I went to work and I found that somebody, a new guy had arrived. He seemed quite inoffensive, quite charming, quite engaging, wanted to be shown the ropes a little bit. We're all happy to do that, showed him the ropes. And this went on for 3 or 4 weeks, a short period of time, until I came in one day and found he'd suddenly been made my boss. And I suppose it was a delayed sense of outrage emerged when I was on holiday, because I wondered if my career path had gone in a particular direction from that moment. Because this guy suddenly, from being a colleague and a rather junior colleague, was now telling me what to do. And I found that very hard to deal with. And I wondered if there were people out there in our community who were perhaps working with bosses who they couldn't quite understand why they were bosses, where they'd come from. And this is part of my understanding of nepotism, is they suddenly just appear, fully formed, ready to go, and nobody quite understands why. So I really wanted to engage with the community and find out if other people had this experience, and whether, like me, 10 years on, they suddenly were feeling a bit annoyed about it.
So just to backtrack for a moment, this person was the nephew, I believe?
He was the nephew of the editor, and before he actually became my boss, we were quite friendly, and he actually confessed to me that his uncle had been told by his mother that his uncle had been told by this guy's mother he had to find him a job, because it was at the time he started work on a proper newspaper. So he was quite open, quite candid about it, and I thought, well, that's quite nice, looking after the family, why not? But when your career starts to get involved, when suddenly you see somebody leaping 4 or 5 steps up, you suddenly start to question this person and the system, and how people get away with that. And I think he had quite an easy ride of things, actually. I think people didn't challenge him as much as perhaps they should. One of the things about British newspapers is that they're not democracies. They're actually more like dictatorships. So you don't tend to challenge as much, a little secret, you don't tend to challenge as much internally the politics as you would challenge the companies you're dealing with externally. So the challenge seems to sort of disappear a little bit inside, and we all fall into line. It's, as I say, it's not a democracy.
So the situation described, I'm sure, will kind of engender feelings of outrage in lots of people who are watching our conversation today. And I think we in the West tend to have a pretty negative view of nepotism, I guess occasionally, unless we are the beneficiaries of that. But that's not the case worldwide, as I understand it.
No, it's not the case. I mean, we have sort of accepted levels of nepotism in the West, and in fields such as acting. I mean, acting dynasties. We have writing dynasties. John Huston, and the Redgraves in the UK. And I mentioned Saul Bellows' son, who wrote a book called In Favour of Nepotism. And it's sort of understood those creative, perhaps painters, artists, the literary creative fields. Maybe people accept in the West that there's a sort of, maybe the creative gene there. that's fine. But when it comes to business or to law or to medicine, yes, families do pull strings, but actually there should be some qualifications. There should be some meritocracy. And America is, founding values of American society is that the meritocracy. Everybody should be able to get on. So it's deeply deep antipathy, I'd say, in the West to this. In other regions, China, for example, the family structures are very important. And also in India, where you don't have perhaps. In India, you don't have the state doing so much for families. The family structure becomes the banking system. It becomes the sort of social system. So there's no surprise then that it becomes the business, the commercial system, because people work together. So you'd find that you'd have great business dynasties there, global, where sons would be groomed in organisations. Also in China, it's very difficult to get business done without a sponsor or without relationships, and family networks are very important. In fact, I've coached a lot of Chinese managers who actually believe that they are in loco parentis. They are the father figure or the mother figure to their people. So that's very deeply rooted in their society, and it's no surprise if people's nephews, their sons, their daughters, their wives come in. And not just family-owned businesses, and make a distinction, proper sort of state-owned businesses or private businesses. This is not a taboo in the way it is in the West. I'll take family companies aside because I think they're a slightly different issue.
Right. So I think we can understand how what we might refer to as nepotism is more prevalent in certain cultures, just based on kind of the roots of those cultures. But ultimately, as emerging capitalist societies like China, like India to some extent, continue to develop, and in this era of global competition and just intense forces, does nepotism hold an organization back from being as potentially creative or effective as it might be?
I believe it does. In fact, one of the people who commented on the blog said that he'd been an ex-senior manager in a Fortune 500 company. He said he has absolutely nothing to recommend about nepotism. It speaks of it speaks of privilege, opening doors for people. It also... I've worked with many companies where you find there are people who are just there because somebody found them a job, and their performance isn't good, their motivation isn't good. They can become quite negative people in organisations. They can create a negative feeling around them, and unless we really open up our companies, our markets, our opportunities to everybody at every level, that this is quite, I believe, quite an insidious. It's an age-old problem, and I guess if you're a beneficiary of nepotism, there's probably a lot to be said for it. If you've got a great job and a great career opening up, but that's one in a million. For other people, this means a barrier to your skills, your talents, your life, your career, getting on, and sometimes also being part of the machinery that keeps this person in their comfortable zone, doing the work for them, covering for them, making allowances for them. I don't think in our very dynamic or global, extremely competitive world that there really is a place for this any longer, and I'd vote to ban this.
Okay. Jill Corkindale, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Political patronage is when a human resource decision is based upon political affiliation. And that can be a positive decision or a negative decision. I can give someone something because of their political affiliation, or I can deny them something because of their political affiliation. It only occurs in government. Patronage is called favoritism in the private sector and the nonprofit sector. Typically, patronage cases arise in hiring and in termination. meaning you fire someone when the new administration comes in, therefore they're being terminated because of their political affiliation, or you're hiring people because of the new administration, and again, that is because of political affiliation. But patronage can occur not only in hiring, but it can also occur in retaining people. It can occur in rifts, promotion, pay, and any other human resource decision. Patronage occurs when a person makes the decision that political affiliation is the major factor in the decision, and uses that political affiliation to make a decision and not legitimate human resource factors. It should be noted that merely because a decision is predicated on political affiliation does not mean that the decision is not legitimate. For some positions, political affiliation is a legitimate consideration. The ultimate inquiry is not whether the label is policymaker or confidential, but rather whether the hiring authority can demonstrate that political affiliation is an appropriate requirement for the effective performance of the public office. There are some positions that, because of the nature of those positions, they are high enough or important enough that the political affiliation of the person in those positions is important, the O in the selection process. That is, you need to have someone who shares the political philosophy of the leadership in order for the political philosophy to be adequately and effectively administered throughout the organization. The test for political patronage in a human resource decision starts off with the obvious question: was political affiliation a factor in the decision-making process? Sometimes that's obvious. Sometimes it's clear that you were looking for, or our organization was looking for, a person that is of a similar political ilk, who had worked in the campaign, who understands the philosophy. There are other times in which that isn't as clear, in which you have to then start looking not only at party affiliation, but looking at the credentials of those people who were not accepted, and making a determination and eliminating, or at least figuring out why they were eliminated, and then concluding that some were eliminated improperly because of political affiliation. And but it's not always you don't always have to go hunting for it. Sometimes it's just quite obviously there. Again, political patronage is something that occurs only in the government sectors. When there's a change in leadership in large organizations, there's almost always concomitantly a change in the top management. That happens in government, it happens at a university, it happens in private sector, it happens in nonprofit. The leadership wants to assemble a leadership team that is consistent with the philosophy of the new leader, and therefore he or she will assemble a leadership team that he is or she is familiar with, that they think will carry out the dictates that, or move the organization in the direction that the new leader wants to move the organization. The next prong of the patronage test is party affiliation an appropriate requirement? And it can be in some instances. You want to have people in your organization, particularly in certain positions, that understand the philosophy, and that will go and be able to speak to others about the philosophy, that will be able to demonstrate that philosophy in their decision making. And in some instances, then why would someone who has a different political philosophy, who is associated with a different political party, want to do such a good job to help a person who is certainly not on of their political ilk, why would they want to help that person do well? Because that's not their philosophy, that's not their team. And so as a result, if the position is one that requires a similar political philosophy, similar political affiliation, then yes, you can use politics. It's the other factor that must be considered in making the decision. And that means people will get fired. And sometimes we often don't like to recognize that. But that happens. Even in non-governmental instances, if you look at a university, when a new chancellor comes in, someone, if there's been a call for change, then the likelihood is those vice chancellors, those vice presidents are going to be fired because there is a new direction. And you want to make sure that you have people who are of a similar philosophy, a similar management style. That happens in non-governmental entities, but we don't call it patronage because it isn't because of a political affiliation. But even patronage isn't really just political affiliation. If you're a Democrat but you're of a different political philosophy, you're not likely to get selected for some of the major decisions. So it's more than just political affiliation, it's political philosophy and management philosophy.
The use of political influence to hire friends and relatives doesn't stop with our university system. For many years, it's been widely known the Department of Motor Vehicles is a dumping ground for political hires, but it took a former deputy commissioner at DMV to tell us just how bad the problem was. WRAL reported that gubernatorial staff, high-ranking legislators, even prominent citizens throughout the state have helped place friends and relatives at DMV. Question one to Chris. Traditionally, one of the perks of an elected office was being able to use patronage to help influence who got jobs. You've been watching this for a while. Is it better or worse than it has been in the past?
Well, it's certainly not much better, but I don't actually think it's much worse. And one of the biggest problems is DMV is part of the Department of Transportation, and that is a whole separate budget in the General Assembly. For years, nobody hardly even paid attention to it except people who were trying to get people's jobs. There was a prostitution ring going on in the department, 20 or 25 years ago in the basement. There have been bid rigging scandals in DMV. We've had a scandal a year in that department, and I'm not confident that's going to change.
So what can be done to eliminate this, Rufus?
Well, you've got a hard-nosed administrator over there, Mike Robertson. And also, let's put it this way. DMV is not the only person where they try to stash people. I know when I was Secretary of State, I got called by everybody in the state government to put somebody on the payroll there. So let's don't leave it all at DMV's footsteps.
How many of those people that called you were your own cousins?
Well, at least I went beyond the first cousin.
And Tom, at least DMV and DOT has kept newspapers in business for a long time.
I'm satisfied with that. Well, they passed a law in '97 to try to restrict political influence. John, has it not worked?
It actually did work to some degree. I think Chris is right that patronage is maybe slightly less abusive than it was back then, but it still created too many opportunities for poor hires.
No matter what you call it, favoritism, patronage, nepotism, HR decisions, human resource decisions, predicated on factors that are not legitimate human resource factors, cause problems in the system. And therefore, we're starting out this course sort of giving you a look at some of the ills in HR. One of the first problems is when you hire less competent, they are less productive, and less productive employees that are being hired, that are being promoted, that are being paid more means that your productivity is down in your organization. With that decreased productivity, you also have decreased morale among your other workers because they perceive this as unfair, as inequitable. And the lack of morale, lower morale leads to lower productivity among those workers, because rather than working, they are talking about how they are being mistreated. They are not incented to do the extra because they think that it doesn't favor them, it won't change their plight, it won't cause them to be promoted because they don't have the affiliation that the people who are getting promoted have. They feel that the workplace is less ethical, less equitable, and therefore you have higher turnover. Higher turnover means you have to bring in and train new people, that those people are less experienced, and therefore they're going to be less productive, and you're going to spend more money. The organization spends more money training now in order to bring productivity back up to the level that it needs to be. And in some instances, particularly for favoritism, but even in patronage and certainly also in nepotism, it leads those practices lead to a lack of diversity. Obviously, if it's nepotism, generally speaking, people in the same family are going to be, by and large, the same race. That's changing now, but in many instances, they're still the same race. That obviously is going to mean that it's going to cut out diversity. Political affiliation, if the political party is not one that is diverse, then diversity goes out the window for several reasons. One, because there are not as many people of different races to choose from, and two, because they feel that they don't have a political obligation to hire people of a different race, since those people didn't bring them to the dance, didn't help them get elected. And so that also has a adverse impact upon diversity. So in all respects, virtually every system of the human resource system, every subsystem of the human resource system is adversely impacted by problems caused by favoritism, patronage, and nepotism.